What's up, you guys? Void here, coming back at y'all with yet another one of my top 10 videos. This time we're going to be looking at the top 10 most chaotic cards in the Commander format. Now it is kind of subjective to point out which card is a little bit more chaotic than the others, so this is more or less just my opinion. Just 10 cards I've played with before, and I honestly feel like these are just incredibly, overwhelmingly chaotic cards. And as usual, before we get on to the top 10, we're going to start off here with some honorable mentions. Just some cards that fell short of making the list, but are still pretty cool. Norrin the Wary, not necessarily chaotic himself, but he does interact with some pretty chaotic cards in the format. Just the interaction with entering the battlefield, it's very random. He dodges a lot of removal. Just fell short of making the list, but still one of the go-to commanders for chaotic decks. He's very awesome. Then we have one of the newest cards here in Disrupt Decorum. Can goad all of your opponent's creatures, so you don't really have to do anything. All your opponents just attack each other, and they have to, which is just amazing if your opponents have developed board states. It's just basically like watching your enemies go to war, and you don't have to get involved whatsoever. It's a perfect card. I absolutely love it. But there are some more chaotic cards on the list that have a more long-term impact on the game, which is the only reason why I think a sorcery like this wouldn't be on the list. And we have Impulsive Maneuvers. This is a card that can control combat. Whenever a creature attacks, you get to flip coins, and you get to decide based off of those flips whether you win them or not. If a creature deals double damage or no damage at all, it is a fantastic card. It just changes the game so much from a combat stance. However, it doesn't stop other decks from winning through alternative win cons, so that's the only reason why it would just be an honorable mention. Then we have Cruel Entertainment, just an honorable mention, but I think it's noteworthy that we do have some black cards that are quite chaotic, and whenever you exchange control of turns, give your opponent's control over another opponent's turn, I think that is fantastic. Yes, you can do this on yourself, but I think it is definitely noteworthy that we do have a black card that does this type of thing. Very enjoyable. We also have Thieves Auction, quite possibly the most chaotic card in this entire video. However, I feel that it loses something whenever you play it and people just don't enjoy it. There are a lot of people who are tempted to just scoop out of frustration. They don't like giving up control of their cards, and I perfectly understand that. I don't want people touching my cards, doing stuff with my cards I don't want them to do, or even forgetting about who gains control of whose cards, card sleeves that look identical. You just don't want anything bad to happen to your cards, so it's just an honorable mention, but I think it's pretty much the most chaotic card in this entire video. Now we move on to the actual top 10 here. Number 10 is Scramble Verse. So for each non-land permanent, you choose a player at random, and then they gain control of each permanent for which he or she was chosen, and you untap those permanents. So it's a pretty fun way of sort of mixing things up, and I think that's what Chaos really is all about in the Commander format. It's not necessarily about the expected outcomes, but more of the chance, the opportunity. If there's a developed board state, well, you want to shake it up a bit. You want to make it a little bit more interesting. This is a card that does that pretty well. However, it is pretty hefty at 8 mana to do this just once at sorcery. So its impact on the game, it's going to be there, but I feel like it kind of falls into that same problem with Thieves Auction. You are going to be giving control of your cards to someone else. They're going to be giving up control of their cards to someone else. And a lot of people just don't like that. I mean, that's the only aspect of Chaos decks that I think people kind of just shy away from. For that reason, they just don't want people stealing their cards or doing anything they just normally wouldn't feel comfortable with. It's kind of just an unspoken rule, just don't touch my stuff or do anything weird with my stuff, and that's completely understandable. The only reason why I would put it on the list over something like Thieves Auction, by the way, is because Thieves Auction, honestly, it just takes much longer when you consider lands. You throw those into the mix, it just makes it so much longer. With Scramble Verse, this is honestly a little bit quicker because you don't throw lands into the equation. So that's the only reason why I would have it on the list over something like a Thieves Auction. I don't think people are as afraid of Scramble Verse. And then we have number 9, which is Pandemonium. Now this is basically a Warstorm Surge, but for everyone's creatures, not just yours. It is 2 mana cheaper, so for some decks this might be a little bit better. But it pretty much does the same thing. If your deck is all about ETBs, creatures entering the battlefield, if you can do that more consistently than your opponents, then you have the advantage with a card like this. But if everyone has a decent amount of creatures that they can take advantage of, then it just becomes all about removing your opponent's creatures with the ETB or dealing damage to their face. It's all about that choice there, that option of being able to affect the game. And I think for the fact that cards like these, they impact everyone, not just you or not just your opponents, makes it more chaotic because you don't always know what the outcome's going to be. So I absolutely love this card, and I throw it into just about every single Chaos deck I build just for that fact, especially with something like Norn the Wary, where he enters the battlefield quite often, so you're able to deal that 2 damage there to a target creature or player. Pretty cool. And number 8, we have Braid's Conjurer Adept. At the beginning of each player's upkeep, that player gets to put an artifact, creature, or land card from their hand into play. Now obviously, if you're going to be playing her as a commander, you're going to have a deck that is pretty much tailored to take advantage of this ability, so considering that, it would have been higher, but the fact that this is going to benefit you, you know exactly what she's going to do. Your opponents aren't necessarily going to know how to take advantage of her the best way. Your deck is going to be filled with stuff that's just overcosted that you can cheat into play. Theirs isn't going to necessarily be as well adjusted, but for the most part, just that randomness, you don't always know what your opponents are going to be putting on the field. They could be putting something that's just ridiculously powerful, something like an Eldrazi, something like a Blightsteel Colossus. I mean, there's a ton of possibilities, awesome artifacts, decent lands. I mean, it's all there. Pretty cool card. Number 7 is Warp World. Now, I put this card higher than Scramble Verse and Thieves Auction, yet another sorcery, but the card itself, I don't feel like it invades people's personal space by taking their cards, so it's a little bit better than that. I feel like people are more willing to participate in this type of act. All you're doing is just shuffling permanents back into your deck, and then revealing that many cards off the top of your deck, and then putting however many cards you can onto the battlefield that way, which really doesn't exchange control, doesn't do anything like that, so you're pretty much a-okay as far as that goes, and it just shakes everything up. It's not always going to redistribute power. Hopefully it does, but usually whoever has the most permanents is going to end up with the most permanents anyway. But at least it just changes it up to the point where if you're suffering and your board state isn't that great, hopefully you get a board state that's a little bit better that you can compete with, and hopefully whoever has the dominating board state doesn't have an even more dominating board state. So that's all you can really hope for with a card like this, but I think it's still fantastic. Number 6 is Knowledge Pool. This is yet another one of those imprint cards. When it enters the battlefield, each player exiles the top 3 cards of their library, and whenever they would cast a spell, instead they can play one of the cards that's exiled with it. It's kind of cool. It's a colorless card. It's pretty chaotic. I know a lot of people would have thought this list would be entirely red cards, but there are some blue cards and there is a colorless card. Knowledge Pool just makes it pretty chaotic. Hopefully the top 3 cards of everybody's library contain something that's worthy of replacing whatever you're casting with it. It's usually sort of a fight to see who can claim that card first, and usually there's a best card among all of those cards that are being exiled, and if you have any way of flickering it or bouncing it back to your hand so you can replay it, then you can do it all over again. Quite an enjoyable card, and there's even a combo with Teferi Mage of Zhalfir so that you can lock your opponents out of doing anything. Casting a card with this card is technically a trigger. They don't happen at sorcery speed, so pretty much Mage of Zhalfir is going to shut down any of your opponents that try to use this. Pretty cool card. Number 5 is Hive Mind. Whenever a player would cast an instant or sorcery, each other player gets to copy that spell and cast it. They get to choose new targets and everything. Purely fantastic, just super chaotic. Another card that I feel is worth mentioning is Eye of the Storm. Very similar card, but I feel like it's a little bit less chaotic because it's only happening for one player at a time whenever they cast an instant or sorcery, but it can also get out of hand pretty quickly. I feel like this card is a little bit more chaotic because it pretty much manages the control player at the table. Whenever they want to do something like counterspell, well, each of your opponents gets to cast a counterspell, countering their counterspell, so it's kind of revenge on the control player at that point, or whoever's really going off with instants and sorceries. Let's say your opponents are trying to cantrip their way to victory. Well, you can cantrip as well. All your opponents get to cantrip. It's fantastic. Really helps to even the playing field at that point. And yet again, another card that's just going to show you that, hey, it's not just mono red that gets into the chaos game. This card is also very chaotic. And then number 4, we have Grip of Chaos. This card is literally chaotic. It has it in its name. Whenever a spell or ability is put onto the stack, reselect its target at random if it has a single target. Now this card is fantastic. Just the amount of time you have to spend reselecting each spell's target, it is quite interesting. And if you do something as simple as cast a Swords to Plowshares and there's like 10 creatures on the battlefield, well then you have to randomly reselect among those 10 creatures which creature's actually going to get hit with the Swords to Plowshares because it reselects the single target at random. And this goes for every single spell or ability that has a single target. So something as simple as Memnarch's first ability is going to target something else, something completely different. And the most frustrating part about this card is the fact that you kind of have to find some way to randomly select, and it's not always easy. There's going to be multiple different permanents that are going to be hit by a single target type of spell or ability, so you kind of have to figure out a way to randomly select, which isn't always an easy task. But if you're able to do it, it is quite a rewarding experience to have a game where nothing's really guaranteed. You're always going to want to think about what you do before you do it, because there's always going to be an unintended consequence. Just a fantastic card and really chaotic. Then number 3, we have Confusion in the Ranks. Now, I know I said this before, people don't always like having to exchange control of their permanents, but I feel like this card does it in a certain way to where it's not going to take a long, frustrating amount of time to really figure out what's going to happen. I feel like with cards like Thieves Auction and Scramble Verse, it's kind of like, well, now we have to really figure out, we have to take 20 minutes figuring out which card's going to belong to who, and it's just very confusing, and sometimes it's easy to mix it up. Well, with Confusion in the Ranks, all you really have to remember is the triggers of creatures entering the battlefield, artifacts entering the battlefield, just anything that enters the battlefield like that, you get to exchange control with it with something your opponent's control of that same card type. So something that would create artifact tokens like Brea is going to exchange control. Those artifacts are going to exchange control with other artifacts your opponents control. The same thing goes with your opponent's creatures and your opponent's artifacts, their enchantments. It's quite chaotic, and it's really something that is going to get out of hand. People aren't going to like it necessarily. What's necessarily going to happen is going to be pretty unexpected, and I feel like that's what chaos is all about in Commander. So is it a frustrating card? Yes, but it is an enchantment. It stays on the field, so it's not initially going to be a frustrating card, but once the game goes on and it progresses, people are going to realize, wow, this card has caused so much problems for us. Creatures are harder to attack with. You can't attack with them because you just gain control of them. They didn't gain haste. That's very frustrating, so you're going to be behind when it comes to swinging with your creatures. Just a frustrating card to deal with, but also a rewarding one. It makes the game longer. It makes it more enjoyable, and sometimes people can't appreciate that. But cards like this that impact the game as a whole, I think are very entertaining, and it's definitely chaotic as well. Then number 2, we have Fairies Puzzle Box. And honestly, it is a chaotic card. I wasn't going to put any wheels on here or even windfall effects because I feel like they're one-time uses, and they're really not that chaotic. They don't change the game that much except for dumping people's hands and then refilling them. What this card does, it basically just says, hey, you don't know what you're going to get, but it's going to be something different. And honestly, with Leovold as a commander in the format, this card was definitely busted, and people were just frustrated, that little 2-card combo there, and there's definitely other ways Leovold was busted, but this card definitely didn't help things out. People are going to have new hands every single turn. They're going to be working with something brand new. They're going to be devising a new plan, but they have to do it right then or there, or the next turn, they're just going to have to lose it all. So it really makes you think. You have to be sort of on your toes. You don't exactly know what your opponents are going to do either. I think it's a pretty cool card, and it's definitely one of the more underrated chaotic cards I don't think a lot of people realize are pretty chaotic. And then number 1, if you haven't guessed it by now, if you've watched other videos of mine, you know that I'm absolutely in love with this card. It is Possibility Storm. Whenever you cast a spell, you exile it, and then you reveal cards from the top of your library until you reveal a card that shares a card type with it. So if it's an artifact, you do it until you hit an artifact. If it's an artifact creature, you do it until you hit either of those card types. So just to clarify there, it's quite chaotic. It works pretty well if you're playing with a deck that has a lot of effects that synergize with cast triggers, because you technically get to cast the card even if it does exile and turn into something else. I can't really think of a card though out of all the chaotic cards on this list that really has an impact that this card does. I mean, Confusion in the Ranks would be the only thing I would think that would compare to it in terms of just affecting the game in the long term. But if this card is left alone, everyone just struggles to cope with it. You have control decks that just don't know what to do anymore because it's all about the expected outcome of their cards and the effects that, they want to know what they're doing. This card completely just takes that away. Now, if you know what your deck is supposed to do, if you know how many instants you have in your deck, if you know how many sorceries, well then yeah, it's probably not going to be as difficult, but if you're playing Possibility Storm, hopefully you're the one with the most well-built deck to deal with the situation, because then you're the one who's being able to take advantage of it more so than your opponents are. But really just a fantastic card. Part of Chaos is really not knowing what you're going to get out of every single card you cast, or not really knowing what each turn is going to represent, what your opponents are going to do even, and really that's what makes chaotic cards more enjoyable for me. So anyway guys, that was my top 10 list of the best chaotic cards in the Commander format. Let me know what your favorite chaotic cards are. Let me know what chaotic commanders you like. Anyway, you guys have a wonderful day. Void here signing off.